and they only have a one-track economy, energy
Yeah.
infrastructure. So he wanted that because that's the one thing that would advantage him. And then all the other things you said, D, it's complete Maximus, give away nothing, ask for everything, and then try to get the other side to fight each other. They're beyond getting the other side to fight each other because they literally have special envoy repeating Russian talking points, which even, I mean, obviously we should be on the side of Ukraine, but even if we're just a mediator,
Right.
you don't repeat any side's talking points. That's not the point, right? You go in, especially in public as a mediator, you just keep talking about the end state.
Hey guys, I want to take a moment to tell you about tonight's sponsor for the show, which is Ridge Wallets. I've been using this for about 6 months now. Really enjoy it. This wallet is made out of carbon fiber, titanium, and steel, and it really holds up and lasts. So, in the past, I carried a leather wallet. It's made by, professional, has a small shop, and does leather work. And I mean, it was a nice wallet, and I really loved it. But the problem with those wallets is they get thicker and thicker and thicker, and we end up carrying around something that's like, a little phone book in the back of our pocket after a while. And that leads to problems with your posture and everything else. So what I like about the Ridge wallet, it's really a minimalist design. So most of us are using cards these days, so it can hold all of your cards in here inside these elastic pieces that you can press out. And then there's a clip on the back. You can, I use it to clip money in when I do use dollars, can clip them in there. They have over 50 colors and styles, so it's not just functional. You can personalize it a bit as well. They have some that feature your favorite NFL teams and so forth. Losing your wallet is also pretty crappy. I've had that happen to me as well. Actually, that wallet, the leather wallet I was telling you about, I lost it on the subway. So there's that. But Ridge has an answer for that, Ridge AirTag attachment. And with that, you'll always know exactly where your wallet is before panic mode kicks in, all right? Ridge isn't just about wallets. They create premium everyday carry essentials like key cases, suitcases, and rings, all built with the same sleek, durable design. So right now, Ridge is having their once-a-year anniversary sale. Get up to 40% off at ridge.com/house. Just head to ridge.com/house to see their biggest sale of the year. After you purchase, they will ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them our show sent you. So guys, please go and check out Ridge Wallets. This also makes a great gift. My girlfriend has one of these. My stepfather has one of these. So I've given them away too.
I have one of them.
And our producer, Dimitri, has one. So please go and check out Ridge Wallets.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Eyes On. Dimitri here with Mick Mulroy, Andy Milburn. A lot cooking since we've last had an episode, so get a comfortable seat, sit back and relax because the world's falling apart. I'm just joking, not really. The big news coming out of the U.S. is it seems like the rhetoric that's coming out is that the U.S. is gearing up for a possible airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. It started earlier this week with us bombarding the Iranian-backed Houthis. I love when media companies say that. That's like they got a notice from wherever they get a notice from that they always have to say Iran-backed Houthis. And they've been hitting the Houthis. I feel like it's been harder than other airstrikes that we've seen over the last year or so since they've been screwing around in the Red Sea. Yeah, let's just start with that because everything kind of entangles into each other. And Israel is sending a delegation to D.C. this week to talk about an attack plan, whether the U.S. is involved directly or gives Israel the green light to just let them go with, I'm sure, support from us. Because Israel's clamoring for it, hitting Iran. So Mick, what do you got on this? What are you tracking?
Oh, there's a lot to cover there, D.
Yes,
so,
there's quite a lot.
Absolutely. Let's start with the Houthis. So Ansar Allah, that's the other, that's their name actually. as you said, Iran backed. They are a proxy of Iran. They're not the greatest proxy of Iran. If there was a scale, I think Hezbollah would be on the top as far as being able to direct them and taking orders, etc. The Houthis are a bit of a wild card, but they are Iranian backed and a proxy. And ultimately, Iran has the influence if it's not just stop giving them weapon systems that they can hit ships with, right? So you gotta be a little skeptical of Iran's claims that they don't have the influence they have. So I would first start with commending the current administration with taking a harder stance, in my view, against the Houthis. Not only have they been a threat to U.S. Military assets, which includes, of course, our sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines. They have been conducting direct terrorist attacks against commercial vessels, killing and injuring civilians that have nothing to do with any of the conflicts going on. And it's important to point out they were doing a lot of this before the war in Gaza even started. So they use that as their, reasoning behind it, but they were doing this prior to that even happening. So I think it's time that we take all the necessary military steps to degrade them to a point of being unable to continue the attacks. They're never going to change their philosophy on attacking the U.S. and Israel. It's literally in their national motto. But we can kill all the leadership, and we can destroy their ability to attack innocent civilians aboard commercial vessels, which, of course, this region, about 40% of the energy of the world comes out of this region. It's mostly depended on by the Indo-Pacific region, not us. So good on them for that. Some would say this could also be a reason to flow a lot of assets. Some you just mentioned. The USS Carl Vinson is also steaming from the Pacific to the Middle East to link up with the Truman, another aircraft carrier. So we're putting a lot of regional assets out there, which I think sends a signal both to the Houthis, and the signal being we're going to, attack you harder than you've been attacked before, but also a signal to Iran that you see how we're dismantling your proxy force here. If you don't come to the negotiation table for JCPOA 2.0 or whatever we're going to call it, which hopefully will include addressing Iran's use of proxy forces in the region as well as nuclear ambitions, then you could be next. So I think there is obviously no decision has been made yet, I don't think, but I think there's a very real possibility that the U.S. could be looking at if Iran has a breakout toward a nuclear weapon. They could easily get to the amount of enrichment they need. They have to come up with a triggering mechanism, which they could get from Russia or North Korea. But if they do that, I do think there's a real possibility that the United States, either in conjunction with or unilaterally, strikes the facilities in Natanz and the other nuclear facilities you mentioned.
Andy?
Yeah, I agree with Mick that the strikes on the Houthis are, the renewed strikes they're overdue. But the concern has never been so much the number of sorties we're flying against the Houthis. It's been having intelligence that is useful enough to result in real-time targeting. In other words, just the nature of Houthi operations means that no matter how sophisticated our intelligence is, they are able to shoot and scoot and clear the area before we can cause really serious damage. Now that's, we are plinking away and we are causing casualties, and essentially we're creating tremendous attrition for them. So one hopes they cannot sustain these efforts for long, but they did fire another rocket at a missile at Israel the other day. So they aren't yet completely on the ropes, and it is the way we're doing things. Again, it's the only thing that we can do. This isn't a criticism, but it is inefficient, and it isn't as effective as it may appear. And to really go after the heart of the problem would be bring pressure on Iran. And so it's hard to tell what the administration is thinking, but definitely that must be foremost in their mind. At the same time, to Mick's point, Iran, by the end, certainly, the last by the last information that the IAEA has, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, Iran was producing about 7 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, which is just below weapons grade every month, which would be enough to make about 2 nuclear bombs per year if enriched further. Okay, so that was towards the end of last year. Since then, the IAEA says that their intelligence, their information has kind of dried up. At the same time, the Israelis are saying, open source, their intelligence guys are saying that they are certain that the Iranians are making a determined approach for breakout, that they are doubling up on their centrifuge activity, and that perhaps even more worryingly, they've moved their centrifuges into areas that are deeper than before. Let me just say that much, okay? And so, kind of interesting. Ehud Barak, who's a former Israeli prime minister, and was until recently a firm advocate of the Israelis kinetically going after Iran's nuclear capability, is now saying that he doesn't think it's going to do any good, that the Iran's program is now too advanced, too deeply buried to take out without U.S. help, all right, without bunker busting bombs, as the media likes to say. So where does all this put us? Oh, the other thing is, do you remember back in 2020, the Israelis killed the most prominent Iranian nuclear physicist? I mean, it was the end of it was culmination of a campaign of going after nuclear physicists. But this guy, his name was Mohsen, I'm going to mispronounce it, Farizadeh, and
Yeah.
and they took him out using that. It was like an automatic machine gun. It was a very unusual type operation. And the problem is now, apparently, and this is according to the Israelis, that there are now 5 or 6 of these guys who've replaced him, which is probably predictable, and are working even harder at upgrading the enrichment process. So all of this is to say that yes, there are a, Israel. It's been a really bad. I'm sorry, it's been a very bad year for Iran. They lost their president in a helicopter crash. They have been struck twice by the Israelis and were unable to bring down a single aircraft, according to the Israelis, and certainly open source information seems to back the fact that they've been largely denuded of their anti-aircraft or their integrated air defense systems. And so it does seem like a good opportunity to strike. And from our own president's rhetoric, when he talks about taking the next step, obviously that would be the next step, but perhaps not quite so predictable. All right. And when we look at some of the internal politics within the administration, two of the biggest Iran hawks are out of favor. Remember, what was his name? Brian Hook was a
Yeah.
big proponent of, he was the Iran envoy in Trump's first term, and he and Pompeo uh, were um, were all about going after Iran, and now they've had their security clearances withdrawn, and actually Hook was fired shortly after President Trump took office this time. And then you look at Eldridge Colby, right? And it's kind of the Pentagon's policy chief who's saying that the intent now is to focus on the Far East. I mean, absolutely do it this time. So, hard to tell. It's hard to read any coherent messaging here. Yes, I'm tracking the movement of aircraft down around, to include supposed landing of F-35s in PSAP, which could be for a number of reasons. I mean, and moving the aircraft carriers to the region, we do these things all the time as kind of a signaling mechanism. It could just be part of our messaging to Iran that we intend to play hard. But I don't know. It's a long way of saying this, but I don't know. I mean, there's certainly mixed messaging. But I'll finish by saying that last year, I posited that the Israelis, if they wanted to, could strike and have serious effect upon Iran's nuclear capability. And that appears to be no longer the case because of Iranian moves. So they would apparently, if the open source information is to be believed, they would need U.S. support for this.
Yeah, and on that point, the munitions when it comes to doing this are very important, right? So the GBU 57, I think. To my understanding, we're the only ones that have it. It's about a 30,000 pound massive ordnance penetrating bomb that can go around 200 feet below the surface before it detonates. And to Andy's point, it's probably necessary to actually have the effects we want on the facilities based on what they've done with them. So that would kind of necessitate the U.S., I believe, unless there's only a certain amount of aircrafts that can carry that too. So I'm not an air guy, so I'm not going to get too far.
Yeah, I was just looking that up. Who carries it?
I think it's a B-2.
Only the B-2, like the F-15 can? I mean, it's that big.
I'd look it up, but
okay.
There's only a certain amount. It's 30,000. Think about it. We talk about these huge JDAMs that are 2,000 pounds. It's 30,000 pounds, right?
Yeah.
So that's one point. The other point I would make that Andy made earlier, certainly agree. It's more than just your intent when it comes to diminishing the Houthis. Part of the way the intelligence apparatus in the United States work, it's the most effective, I think, in the world. But it is finite, so they only have what they have, and they often shift based on policy interests of senior leadership, right? So, and I don't know this to be necessarily true, but when the Biden administration de-emphasized the Houthis, took them off the terrorist list, the chances of the intelligence community then shifting collection on them is high. It doesn't mean they just dumped it, but based on these signals, they would shift. So now that there's a new administration who's obviously more interested in being effective against the Houthis, militarily effective, that the intel has to catch up. So it can catch up pretty quick, but it has to be retasked in some cases to really get that solid picture. And I think one of the reasons why they're talking about leadership targets in Yemen right now is because the intel is catching up. So good for us, bad for the Houthis.
Hey guys, it's Jack. I just want to talk to you for a moment about how you can support the show if you've been watching it, enjoying it, but you'd like to get a little bit more involved and help us continue to do this. You can check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/theteamhouse. And for $5 a month, you can get access to all of these episodes of The Team House ad-free. The same goes with our affiliated podcast, Eyes On, with Andy Milburn, Jason Lyons, Mick Mulroy. That one, you will also get all of those episodes ad-free. And you support the channel and the show, and we really appreciate it. The Patreon members are literally what has helped this company, this small business survive, especially during our early years. And you are what continues to help this thing going, even as we navigate the turbulent world of YouTube advertising. So we really appreciate all of you guys. There's going to be a link down in the description to that Patreon page, and there is also going to be a link to our new merch shop. So if you guys want to go and get some Team House merchandise, we got stickers, and we also have patches. And I should mention, if you sign up for Patreon at $10 a month, we will mail you this patch as well. So we really appreciate that. But they're also for sale on the merch shop. And additionally, they got t-shirts up there, water bottles, a tote bag, coffee mugs, all that good stuff. So please go and check them out and support the show. We really appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
And yeah, it can only be carried by big bombers, B-2, and probably the B-52.
Okay,
yeah.
U-57. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that means also, to Andy's point, you got to get rid of the integrated air and missile defense system of Iran before you really conduct these strikes. Right? These are big aircraft, and they're going to be coming in, the way they do. So they're going to have to take out a lot of Iranians. So the best case scenario is they come to the table and we come to an agreement that keeps them from getting a nuclear agreement, stops them from paying every militant group in the region to attack its neighbor, and it gets sanctions removed off the Iranian people so they can join the world economy and do well. Right? That's the way we want to go. We shouldn't want to end up with a military strike, because the question is, what's the reaction? What comes from that? And it's, I'm not saying we don't do it, but I think the diplomatic path forward, which I think the administration wants to see, is the path. But it's really going to come down to Iran, who so far don't seem to be interested, per the Ayatollah.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, not in fairness, but to be accurate, Iran's in a quandary too. I mean, they've lost their missile stockpiles last year, their air defenses and regional allies, with downfall of Assad and also the demise of Hamas, Hezbollah on the ropes, and now the Houthis. And so on one hand, that does make a nuclear option more attractive. But on the other hand, they're in a very poor position to weather the fallout if they are caught in the process of dashing for a bomb. And the Israelis have demonstrated a remarkable degree of penetration of Iran over the last year too, which means that the Iranians are probably concerned that they cannot break out without the rest of the world, or make rush for a breakout without the rest of the world finding out.
Right.
So they've got a new president who seems a moderate, but was it Pezeshkian? But he's a weak president with very little say on nuclear policy. But those with real power within the administration, the Iranian regime, do have good reasons to cut a deal. They're in dire economic straits. And as said, they've lost their allies, and they must be, even if a combined Israeli-U.S. strike doesn't achieve its objectives, that's still going to leave Iran in a very poor position from the fallout. So I think, I would be surprised if Iran doesn't broach some kind of negotiated settlement. But to Mick's point, and I agree absolutely, the missing part from the JIGPOA was a lack of leverage, or both our inability, but we didn't even try to bring pressure on Iran to stop its gray zone activities, use of proxies in the Middle East, and now, of course, specifically the Houthis are the main problem.
Just for anybody listening, the JIGPOA is the first Iran nuclear deal under the Obama administration. Just FYI.
Yeah, and Britain, France, and Germany, who are rarely aligned on Iran, have all said that they would be willing to, reimpose just the full gamut of pre-2015 sanctions in Iran. And they said that, as recently as December, focused on non-proliferation. So there's certainly a lot of pressure, and Iran must be sensing the pressure to negotiate. And they've got internal problems too. Mick can probably talk about it better than I can, but they're dealing with they have never been totally impervious. Certainly not in the last 2 decades. Well, not since the Orange Revolution, whenever that was, 2009. Was it orange or green? I forget the color. But they've never been impervious to public opinion. I mean, they have, yes, their elections are sham elections, but they nevertheless, the regime is concerned when there are rumblings of discontent, and there are increasing rumblings of discontent within Iran They've got a very highly educated middle class that wields probably more power than in most countries in the Middle East, or more influence. And they are unhappy. They're unhappy with Iran's adventuring overseas. They're unhappy with the isolation, and they're especially unhappy with the economic situation.
That's true. They are very unpopular. And another thing you reference is the president actually is more focused internally, right? So the Ayatollah and they make all the big decisions, the nuclear decisions, frolicking overseas and IRGC and all that. But they are a very unpopular regime in Iran. And, if they do enter into the JICPOA 2.0, this could be very good for the country, which wants it. So there's a way ahead that's clearly best for the region and best for Iran, or at least the Iranian people. But right now, the regime seems to be only focused on the regime, which is what usually regimes focus
on. Staying in the area, Israel restarted its military action on Gaza. Ton of airstrikes, ground force movements. They've really turned the heat up, I would say. They've also started bombing southern Lebanon, some Hezbollah positions as well.
Yeah.
So ceasefire seems to have, begun. Mick, what are you looking at there?
Yeah. So, I mean, part of this was because Israel wanted to extend the first phase of the ceasefire, right? So that would mean hostages still come out, Palestinian prisoners are released, and humanitarian aid comes in large quantities. Hamas wanted to go to the second phase because that means the IDF has to withdraw, and essentially the war's over. And the third phase, of course, gets into reconstruction and all that. So Netanyahu wasn't going to be able to hold his coalition if he withdrew the IDF. Not that the world should care necessarily about Prime Minister Netanyahu's political future, but that's a reality for him. So Hamas then rejected the extension. So that's just looking at it from their perspective, right? So there's no humanitarian aid coming into Gaza right now. That shouldn't happen, but it is. Hamas doesn't apparently care, right? So because they could extend the first phase and they could release hostages that never should have been taken hostage in the first place, and we could be where we are. But they aren't. So I think because the ministers came back into the government, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, there's probably a good likelihood that we're not going to see a ceasefire anytime soon. I don't think they would have came back in without talking to Netanyahu, and then there's a ceasefire. That's the reason why they left in the first place, right? So that's my speculation. I don't obviously know anything specific, but I think we're going to be set for a pretty long, extended period of fighting here. It's in the north, it's in the central, and it's in the south. I think the whole time during the 2-month ceasefire, they were collecting intel, as I would be too, and preparing for this phase of the operation. So that's why it happened so quickly when it did, and that's why it's quite frankly been very effective going after what's left of the leadership. And I think this is going to keep going. Israel is claiming that they're going to create these humanitarian zones where people in Gaza would be going to, hopefully to receive humanitarian assistance. But anybody left out would be deemed, enemy combatant, and that, from a military perspective would be easier, but it does appear to be, serious population control. And then, of course, we still have these reports that countries have been approached about taking Gazans, which, again, is very impractical and likely unlawful. But that's where I think we are now. There's also, and I know, I stick to national security and politics, but there's a lot of politics going on in Israel right now. So the beginning of the fighting again was super unpopular by some. Prime Minister Netanyahu has fired Shin Bet. They're basically their internal service chief. Apparently the cabinet's now removed the attorney general. I would call it a constitutional crisis for Israel, but they don't have a constitution, which is one of the reasons. So there's a lot going on right now, internal strife inside Israel. The far right thinks that the judiciary has too much. Sound familiar? Has too much authority. The far left thinks basically Prime Minister Netanyahu's went from a traditional conservative to some kind of French monarch where he considers himself the state. Right? The state is me. that's kind of, I think, a thumbnail sketch of the current situation. But it does affect the war, right? So this could have a profound effect on the war, and so that's why I bring it up. But those are what I see going now. Lebanon, let's hope it doesn't kick back off the people of Lebanon, and certainly people in northern Israel. But they have to be able to get control. That's one thing. The government in Lebanon has to get control over the armed factions in Lebanon. They have to. They have to figure it out. Or UNIFIL needs to figure out how they can do more, which I don't have any confidence in. But they're literally, if they just say, well, it's not us, it's that group of people that are in Lebanon that are attacking you, then it's going to kick back off. Anyway, over to you, Abe.
Yeah, so I mean, the war is intimately bound up with Israeli politics. Netanyahu did a number of things to kind of line this up, firing the previous chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces and bringing in Lieutenant General Zamir, who is I wouldn't say a Netanyahu loyalist, but seems to have views that are aligned with Netanyahu. And Zamir has said, he favors a longer campaign, bringing armored divisions in on the ground inside Gaza to root out Hamas fighters, which is, obviously having a catastrophic effect on the population there. I mean, the redisplacing population again to these so-called humanitarian zones. Infrastructure is pulverized. They've been dealing with near starvation now for months. Again, we shouldn't forget the scale of misery within Gaza. That doesn't affect Israeli politics. I don't think most Israelis really that really factors with them. But the deploying the number of divisions that Zamir envisions for his war plans is going to have a severe effect on the Israeli population. It's going to include tens of thousands of reserve troops who've yet to be mobilized, okay, with all the follow-on effects on the economy and disruption of lives. That will have an effect. For Netanyahu himself, the timing of Israel's renewed attack on Gaza was politically fortuitous. His coalition was in danger of losing its majority on the eve of a critical budget vote, and if that had failed to pass, then it would have prompted early elections. And then, as Mick talked about, within hours of the strikes on Gaza, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's an old friend of this program, leader of the far-right Jewish Power Party, and he had left the government back in January, and then he returned to the fold, which indicates, yes, that there was some kind of deal between him and Netanyahu. And certainly Netanyahu is anxious to rally his base because of a controversial attempt to fire the head of the Shin Bet. I'm sorry, and the Attorney General. There are investigations into Netanyahu's close aides who are alleged to have leaked classified documents and received payments from Qatar. And then, of course, the corruption charges against Netanyahu himself, right? And then, it could be that the Supreme Court could block some of these efforts, Netanyahu's efforts, political efforts on the grounds of conflict of interests, which would again lead to a constitutional crisis, which has been building since before the war. Frankly, I mean, remember the fact that his coalition wanted to pass sweeping legal reforms to weaken the powers of the Supreme Court, and all of that was kind of eclipsed by the war, but it goes bubbling on in the background. So it does look as though, regardless, that there is going to be some kind of political crisis in Israel, and the renewed offensive in Gaza provides, I'm sure, well, not I'm sure, provides a welcome distraction to Netanyahu and his proteges.
Yeah, I mean, Mick, I remember when the ceasefire first came into effect, or they were like close to it, and we were talking about the points of it, where like phase 2 kind of didn't seem like really viable. of an option where like the IDF backs out and then some other magical security force comes in and keeps the law and order and stuff. So, I mean, it's as a cynical person that I am, it doesn't really seem that shocking that Israel wanted to extend phase one because phase two was fanciful.
Yeah. And part of this is the rest of the world isn't stepping up, right? So
Yeah.
if I remember when Secretary Blinken, last administration, went around asking all the countries in the region about a multinational, peacekeeping force, if you will. They got a big no, right? So that's off the table. So what's left? Is there some kind of version of, can they train, the former Palestinian police? Can they train Palestinians that are vetted and not associated with Hamas, for example, or PIG or J, excuse me? I guess they could. Maybe that should be happening. Seems like something that the international community could be doing. Or they could go with a private company, and there's always issues with private security because whose laws do they fall under? Who are they? When something bad happens, all of a sudden the governments that hired them are pointing at them. So I mean, I'm not saying any of these are easy, but I mean, from Israelis' perspective, they're not going to turn it back over to Hamas. Like, that's just not going to happen. I don't care what side of the political spectrum you are in Israel. That solution is a non-starter.
What about the Palestinian Authority? Because I know there was some talk about like, no, they're not them either.
Well, I mean, the reason why the last administration called them the revitalized Palestinian Authority is because largely they're viewed negatively by the Palestinian people. They are, for the most part, ineffective and certainly corrupt. So there has to be some new version of that. And then under that, there could be a trained, keep the peace force, right? Easier said than done. And I spent a lot of time training partner forces like that. So, but the best day to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best day is today. So if they intend this to ever have a time when the IDF can withdraw and Palestinians can take care of their own security, which means also Israelis' security, right? So not allowing any group in there to attack Israel. It's got to start. So it doesn't seem like anybody's talking about that.
Yeah. So one interesting thing about, well, a number of interesting things about what's going on. I mean, the IDF's really, they're not, it's not so much, well, they are fighting on four fronts. So they're maintaining a robust presence on four fronts. There's Gaza, where they are going on the offensive again. Southern Syria, beyond the Golan Heights, maintaining a presence there in accordance with Netanyahu's declaration that he did not want the HTS pushing south of Damascus. The HTS, of course, is the ruling party in Syria now. And then you've got the West Bank, where the Israelis have mobilized reserve battalions to bolster their presence in the West Bank, and of course Lebanon. They've got five. They're maintaining 5 fortified locations in southern Lebanon, which, by the way, you can look at this as you want. You can say it provides, in justification of the government, as it provides a buffer zone and for the security of Israeli civilians in the north. But on the other hand, and the Israelis encountered this during their 20-year-long occupation of Lebanon, it provides Hezbollah cause d'etre to rise again, right? To expel the Israeli occupier as a kind of focus of effort, and it continues to keep kind of the sheer resentment simmering. So it's a double-edged sword. The other reason, I mean, it's unlikely. Who knows whether the U.S. administration will come down on the Israeli government and have them downscale any of these military presences anytime soon. But the pressure is likely to be internal, and it's likely to be economic. Israel's economy has suffered hugely since the events of October the 7th, and they continue doing so. We're not just talking about loss of tourism and all of that. We're talking about, of course, the cost of the economy of having a significant proportion of the population mobilized as reservists, and a lot of the guys in all of these locations are reservists. And as I mentioned earlier, in order to continue the offensive against Gaza, they're going to have to mobilize many more reservists. So there's significant economic pressure to kind of downscale these commitments, but there doesn't seem to be an end in sight.
Mick, you got anything? I mean, it was pretty succinct.
We covered all that.
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I was just saying there's another aspect here that Netanyahu doesn't seem to care about. I think probably some of his generals and some of the more moderate members of his coalition do too, is the fact that they are burning bridges rapidly with two of their most important partners in regional partners. Partners is a strong word, but they're neighbors, Egypt and Jordan. And relations have never been worse. Well, not never, not since 73. Okay. Relations have not been worse with those than those two countries than they are now. And there's, I mean, you can say what you want, and Netanyahu can pound his chest and say we're the biggest bully in the neighborhood. But on the other hand, if you're going to burn bridges like that, there's going to be a cost. And it's worth remembering that 50% of Jordan's population are Palestinians and are incensed about what is going on in Gaza. And there's a long, porous border with Jordan. It's quite easy to cross. And so, you can't, and of course there is with Egypt. You can't help thinking that Israel may be sowing the seeds for serious problems over the next decade.
Jesus. All right, let's go to a little bit more of
talking about this for a long time.
Yeah. Let's go to season 10 of Eyes On. We'll be talking about this. Happier news, I guess, which I'm joking. The Ukrainian ceasefire, lots gone on since I think we last spoke. The U.S. and Ukraine came together and had a ceasefire proposal for 30 days to not hit infrastructure, like energy infrastructure. That didn't last more than like 4 hours. Putin put out his own plan, which seems to be, zero concessions on his side. Obviously, like what to be expected. Why would he give up anything when our own side is, the United States anyway, is happy to give him as many concessions as he'd like. Trump and Putin had a 2-hour phone call the other day. And I'm going to bring it up, the very interesting interview with Tucker Carlson and Steve Witkoff, where Steve Witkoff, I mean, was, I guess describing the relationship between Putin and Trump as being the best of friends. And it's kind of wild to see that this stuff's coming from inside the house, where Putin is somehow, some way, somebody who can be trusted in any way to negotiate. And it's coming from our own officials for the most part. And it's disheartening to say the least. And forget it if you're from Ukraine. I mean, at that point, or Europe. So that's just me running my mouth. Mick, what do you think?
Well, I'll try to start with one positive is, at least we're talking, right? Because you're never going to get to a ceasefire negotiated settlement without talking. And the other point is, Ukraine is not losing, right? I mean, talk about a group that's been completely underestimated from the beginning till now. And there's a plausible way ahead if Europe steps up, that even if the U.S. steps out, which would be a huge mistake, not just for Ukraine and our status in the world, but for all our relationships going forward, who would deem us a completely unreliable ally and partner. But there is a way that Ukraine can stay in the fight. It won't be easy, but Russia's losing so many troops right now that even though they could care less about that personally, it eventually runs out, and they're gaining very little terrain with the amount of expenditure of force. On the issue of the ceasefire, essentially Russia rejected the ceasefire proposal by the United States. We keep saying, oh, they said yes, and then said, but only infrastructure, energy infrastructure, And by energy infrastructure, I mean our infrastructure, because they immediately turned around and attacked Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And really, the only reason why they're focused on energy infrastructure is because Ukraine has been incredibly effective against targeting
They hit
Russian
super deep
energy
into it.
infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
And they only have a one-track economy, energy
Yeah.
infrastructure. So he wanted that because that's the one thing that would advantage him. And then all the other things you said, D, it's complete Maximus, give away nothing, ask for everything, and then try to get the other side to fight each other. They're beyond getting the other side to fight each other because they literally have the special envoy repeating Russian talking points, which even, I mean, obviously we should be on the side of Ukraine, but even if we're just a mediator,
Right.
you don't repeat any side's talking points. That's not the point, right? You go in, especially in public as a mediator, you just keep talking about the end state, but you also don't talk about what's called, for the policy wonks, there was a final status issues. That's what's supposed to come out the other end. You don't talk about it publicly because that's the whole point of the negotiation process. So, obviously not taking advice from me, but I would advise that we are openly for Ukraine because they're our partners, and we did promise them security guarantees back in 1994, and that General Kellogg should be running this thing, as he was. But at the very least, stop talking about it publicly. Stop issuing declarations on final status issues, and start coming up with sticks for Russia, because they're not going forward with this unless we start talking additional sanctions, enhanced security assistance, so more, not just what we were given, but more, and then whatever else we can come up with for sticks, and then give Russia a reason to come to the table. They'll start losing terrain if we double down on our security assistance. They'll start losing the funding to pay for the North Korean troops, the Iranian drones, if we further damage their economy through sanctions. So that's how you get across to Russia. You could compliment them all day long. They'd be happy with that, but it's not going to make it a hill of beans. They only understand consequences. And if there's no consequences, then they're just going to drag this out until, and the last point that I'd make is, and Prime Minister Meloni made this, right? So the conservative Italian Prime Minister, the only reason why Russia cares about security guarantees is because they intend to attack Ukraine, right? If you don't intend to re-attack Ukraine, then what do you care about security guarantees? Or it doesn't matter, right? So I think Europe's waking up, and that's a good thing, and they should have woke up a long time ago. They're going to work on their own defense, and I think they're going to quadruple down if they need to on Ukraine, because it's definitely in their interest to stop Putin in its tracks in Ukraine and eventually, get Ukraine into the European Union, and then whatever version comes out of NATO, if that's really where we're headed, which would be a mistake if we leave it. Oh, one more point on that. If we actually get Europe to the point where it is an extraordinarily effective military force, all paying twice as much as they used to pay on their own defense, and then leave NATO, that would be, from a strategic perspective, incredibly short-sighted. We would literally have to make up in our defense budget what we just cut ourselves away from by leaving the NATO, although I don't think it's going to happen. But since people like to talk about this so much, it would make no sense from solely the U.S. perspective to leave an entity that's now a incredibly effective fighting force, which Europeans will be one day. All right, off the soapbox.
Andy.
Yeah, the problem is that Mick and I agree on too much stuff, so I'm not going to. I couldn't word it better than Mick did. I agree with him on all those counts. So I'll just approach this from a very different and perhaps a personal level. So first of all, I'm not going to rail away about my concern about the fact that we seem to be cozying up to Putin. My feelings about the Russians are well known, and maybe I'm just overly emotional because they did try to kill me on a number of occasions, and I take that very personally. And to Mick's point about Europe stepping up to the plate, I think, and actually playing the mature party in all of this, I think it's spot on. It just is as a comment too, because invariably, and I read when I read the comments about our appearances on Eyes On, and we've got some great supporters, and we've got some people who reappear, and I call them supporters too, but they're kind of they're motivated by hatred and resentment, and they regularly critique us increasingly for our lack of loyalty to the United States, which seems to me absurd. But I would like to comment on about this, this whole discussion about what the defense of Ukraine stands for, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I spent 31 years in uniform, fought in wars on the behalf of the United States from Mogadishu all the way through to the fight against ISIS. And, one thing that I never really made sense to me was when people thank me for defending our freedom, because our freedom has never been at threat. This country has not during my lifetime. And while I certainly acknowledge and appreciate the thank you for your service and all that, but this constant talk about how we're defending the freedom of the United States was all bullshit when it comes down to it. We were doing what we had to do. I'm not undermining the patriotism of my comrades in arms, but we were doing what we had to do on behalf of our country, on behalf of the national interest, but we weren't defending freedom at all. Ukrainians are defending freedom, okay, maybe not of the United States, but of Europe, and they're defending ideals that I sometimes found difficult to align with what we were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan. That is why it makes sense for guys like Nate Vance, who we interviewed the other day, or indeed myself, or the guys in the Mozart group to have been in Ukraine when we were doing what we did. And that's probably all I need to say on this, and why it makes perfect sense now, and continues to make perfect sense that Europe is stepping up to the plate, and that it makes no sense at all to rely on Putin or the Russians to hold the peace. I mean, you don't even have to be a student of history. You just have to read the news over the last decade or so to understand that. And that probably brings me, and I'm sounding like an angry, one of our angry listeners, but I think a lot of the problems with this cozying up to Russia right now, and I'm watching the welter of weirdness on social media. It comes from people who are really, really fucking ignorant and just don't. They don't even read recent history. They don't understand geopolitics. That's really what it comes down to, and it's sad. And but the isolationism in the last century has not worked well for the United States, and it won't work well now. That is all.
Yeah, and if I could make one point on it, what Andy just said, as far as patriotism versus the alternative being, I guess, treachery, as when I look at it, your patriotism or lack thereof has to do with your fidelity to the Constitution and your service to the country, right? So, you could be, Mark Kelly, to use the example of somebody who was called a traitor, who obviously isn't, or Mike Waltz. Right? It shouldn't be based on your political position. If that's the case, that's not patriotism. That's just partisanism. And that's the way I view it. So if you're calling somebody a traitor because you disagree with them politically, I mean, you might want to redefine your definition of patriotism. And that's not just with, names we recognize, but, obviously you have a lot of friends that served, in fact, most of them. And they're from across the political spectrum. Right. But I don't define their service to their country or their status as a patriot or not based on, whether they're far right, far left, or somewhere in the center. So if you do, then we just fundamentally disagree on the definition of the word.
Yeah, very well said by both of you guys. I have a question. There is a prevailing thought that I'm seeing, that the Russian economy now, how it's constituted because of the war, is heavily reliant on the war continuing. And that might be a reason why Putin is apprehensive to make a deal. I think that's bullshit, but that is a prevailing thought that's going on right now. Because at some point, I mean, you lose enough guys. I mean, what is your economy without the people in it to work it? And
the next
right.
generation. I mean, I don't know. I'd like to hear somebody who kind of thought that through. I'd be interested to hear from somebody who knows more about economics than I do, but explain it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I do think right now he thinks he could still gain territory and potentially. I think that's one of the reasons. But if this is another, I'd like to hear it. You know.
Yeah, I haven't heard that, D, and to me, I'm not an economist, but it simply doesn't make sense. You know, the economy is taking a shellacking, and I think I think it's just much more basic than that. Putin has staked everything on this war. It was his war. You know, it was a GRU war, an FSB war. It was not a military, his military weren't telling him to do it. They were pretty docile in the face of it, but has been, since the outset of the war, increasing resentment against the administration regime from within the military. Remember Prigozhin's kind of attempted coup and the fact that he was almost embraced by many within the army's leadership. Putin knows that. He must know that, and he knows that his position is precarious if he cannot show some gains from this war. I mean, he hasn't, to begin with, for the first 18 months of the war, he was more or less able to kind of isolate the Russian public from the effects of casualties, but the war is increasingly unpopular, and he's had to take increasingly draconian measures to stamp down on opposition. If it is shown to subsequently, if the outcome is shown to be anything but a victory, he looks very poor indeed. And again, however strong or insulated he may feel, just to look at, again, post-Soviet Union Russian history shows that as a leader, you've got to be dynamic in Russia. In other words, having success either with the economy or in some other way, or you're gonna sink, and someone's going to come after you, and Putin knows that. That is why he wants to prolong the war. As long as there is a war, there is something to focus on. There's something to focus his repressive measures within the country on, something to justify them by. Without the war, once it ends, there's going to be a backlash, and he knows that.
Yep.
Yeah. Very well said. I have one more question having to do with Russia. I've heard, and there is another thought that the reason why we're trying to reset things with Russia is because we want to drive a stake in between Russia and China, and that's why we're doing that. That's why we're being more buddy with Russia. I agree that I feel that's bullshit as well, but
it's been a long-term policy objective of the United States, the Sino-Soviet split going back to Kissinger and all that. I mean, it's not a bad idea, especially during the Soviet Union times, the Cold War. It's not going to work. I mean, it's just not. And of course, ours is going to cycle, right? So we haven't really ever had anybody who was pro-Russian as a president. So let's say that.
Yeah.
But as it cycles, we're not going to stay consistent. Put it that way. The Soviet in China, the Russian in China leadership is probably going to stay consistent, considering they're autocrats. So it's just not going to work. I think we could try to drive a wedge, but we just have to be realistic in the fact that it's never actually worked, and that cozying up to the Russians is only going to last as long as it's at advantage to the Russians. So I looked up how many times Russia has invaded a country since like 1940, I think, 1930s, late 30s. It's like 11 times, including two countries twice, one of them being Ukraine. So like the idea that you can trust these folks for a ceasefire, I mean, it just defies Wikipedia. Just Google it, look it up, right? So, I mean, the past is prologues, man. So if you want to see what they have done in the past when they've signed agreements or said they wouldn't do something and then did, there it is. So be careful who you buddy up to. It is not in our interest, never has been, and at least with somebody like Putin in charge, it won't be.
The fact that anyone actually believes that cozying up to Russia is going to help us against China just shows a level of ignorance that's beyond comprehension. I mean, let's just be clear. Russia is a second-rate, tin-pot fucking autocracy. It's a paper tiger. Okay, China is a powerhouse. We do need to be concerned about China, but dividing a wedge between the two countries, A, as Mick pointed out, is impractical. Uh, and B, does us no good at all, and certainly not by cozying up to Russia. I mean, Russia's our adversary. We've said this before. Russia is not our friend. All right. NATO, the countries in NATO are our friend. The countries in NATO, as we talked about before, but I'll just remind people because apparently there are still those who don't understand NATO. The only time they've activated Article 5 in NATO was in the defense of the United States. And by the way, that was a very generous extrapolation on those countries' part so that they could come to our aid in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, what, Canada's our enemy now? I mean, come on.
Right. And Russia's economy is about half of that of California.
Yeah.
Right. So if we want these folks, which have zero to trade, to be our primary trading partners, we're in a lot of problems. They are everything that Andy just said. And we just need to be careful on this.
Yeah. Again, I didn't believe that. I'm just saying what I've been hearing in terms of like other shows and folks that think they're like folks that are in this sphere, I guess. I've heard that a few times and I'm just like, how does that make fucking sense? I mean, you just look at like a guy like Medvedev, who was like the president there for a little bit while Putin was, running things in the background before he changed the constitution in Russia. It looked like there was like a great relationship between him and Obama. You see him now, he's full on cuckoo, full on crazy warmonger dude, tweeting off, shooting off tweets that are like insane if you read them. And the fact is, and we've talked about this before, Andy, you said it, like he was full of shit then, just like he's, this is who he really is. And this is how the Russian power, power players really do it. Like they're full of shit for the most part.
It just frightens me, the level of ignorance, honestly. I mean, within our own country, and I don't know. I don't know if it's the education system. I don't know if it's the fact that we feel insulated by two oceans, even in this area of globalization. But just kind of it's more than lack of education. It's just kind of lack of real interest. It's as though we just don't pay attention to what's going on in the world collectively, and it has frightening consequences at times. And watch, there'll be a deluge of people accusing me now of being a traitor and undermining the United States and being a US hater and et cetera, against whom, I will again remind you guys that I spent 31 years in uniform defending freedom, but on the behalf of the United States. And obviously, in real terms, a patriot.
Yeah. Well, boys, that was spicy. I like getting Andy worked up and red hot. He makes for good podcast listening.
All right. Worked up.
Don't forget to check out the show, to subscribe to the show, like the show. If you're listening to us on audio, rate it and subscribe there. Andy Milburn, When the Tempest Gathers, a tremendous book. Read it. The link is in the description as well. Any and all of his links to Twitter, just any link that you want to find Andy, it's in the description. Mick Mulroy, Lobo, Fogbow, doing great work. All of his links are in the description as well. If you want to follow Mick on social media, links are in the description. And yeah, this was great. Do me a favor, guys. Buy some merch or join the Patreon, patreon.com/the Team House. You get the Team House ad-free. You get Eyes On ad-free and early access. And if you join at $10, you get a patch, a Team House patch. sent from me to you. So thank you guys. This is great.
Have a great rest of your Sunday.